Yeah, I was saying earlier at the first service that if you could figure out a way to bottle spirit-empowered connection cards, there's a market for that with pastors, and your church would have no problems with money ever again. So, and I got the same joke, laughing response. Apparently, that's like a pastor joke. So let me say this. This I was hoping she brought up. I was like, no, I'm going to go one more try. Didn't work again. So I'm going to kill that joke. But I do want to say, I wanted to say, Dan and Kelly, I don't have to tell you, because you know better than I do, they're great pastors and they're great people, and I love them. We've been friends for a long time now. And but I just also want to say, like, you are a great church. Do you know that? And you could say yes, it's okay. You're not going to steal, no crowns are being stolen, or no jewels are taken. But I've been following your church for a long time, since it met on Thursday nights at Heritage, whatever, and since the beginning. And you guys do great things. I love your heart for the nations. I love, love, love your heart for engaging and empowering everyone in the church to be involved. And I was saying also earlier when we were huddling up before the service this morning, like, you guys are like way ahead of wherever we were in terms of just like quality, like, of the thing. I mean, I didn't even preach with shoes half the time. And so you guys are this is that's a true story. People walked out like, he doesn't have shoes on, and left. So fact happened. And so you guys are doing, I'm so excited to be here again. And I love you guys, and I pray for you often. And I just want to just speak blessing over you, that this church would be a light to the surrounding neighborhood, and that lives would be transformed. I pray blessing that you would be the most faithful and fruitful that God would dream of for you. That you would press in and lean in all the way with Jesus, because my sense is there's a need for you. You're important in the kingdom of God. And that's you. This is like the church. It says it's not this. Dan and Kelly aren't even the church. Who's the church? You are, right? So I just want to pray blessing that you would lean in with all that you can to be all that God would have for you. And Jesus, I just pray a blessing on this community of disciples of Jesus. And I just pray, God, that you would come and be with them in every way, that you would just provide and meet them, and that people, the community here, would lean into you, Jesus. They would say yes to you. They would keep saying yes to you. And that it's summer, it's 4th of July weekend. I'm impressed with how many people are here, God. And I know Dan's heart is always like that. As the temperature rises, our spiritual enthusiasm wouldn't go down. But Lord, that we would keep leaning into Jesus. And I pray that would continue to be true here for this community. That it would be a summer of growth spiritually. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, it's my privilege to get to talk this morning, and as some of you may know from social media or the bulletin, if you read it, that my wife and I, who's here, Megan and I, spent 40 days in May and June, which essentially was Mother's Day to Father's Day. We walked 484 miles across southwest France and northern Spain on the El Camino de Santiago. I put 500 miles, but if you count the miles we walked to and from hotels and restaurants, I think we added that 16 extra miles. I think we made it up. So the sermon this morning is called I Would Walk 500 Miles. You know, maybe you've heard the song. But there's a map on the thing here. This is a mural that shows, no, not that one. Yeah, that one. So this sort of shows our route. This is only part of it. This is not the real map of Spain, in case you're curious. This is simply an artistic rendition. The buildings are not to scale. They're not really that big compared to the countryside. And so, but we walked all this way across from France to Spain. It was wonderful. We had, it included 2 days of travel, 3 rest days, and 35 days of walking, averaging just under 14 miles a day. I want to give my wife props. She was a rock star, killed that route every day, did amazing walking all those days, because it's hard to walk 14 miles and then wake up the next day and at breakfast, like, we're going to walk 14 more miles. You don't get to just choose to not walk because your hotel's there. So you got to do it. So pilgrims, or peregrinos, as they're called locally, have been walking this trail for a long time. I think we have some pictures here of a couple of famous pilgrims. I think the first slide, there's two famous pilgrims. That's my wife, Megan, and Pablo Payo. I don't even know who that is. So this statue, that was her new best friend from the trail. And there's a statue there. This is a couple other pilgrims showing what it's like looking to Jesus on the cross. People have been walking this trail for 1,200 plus years. So like 6 times older than America. And even in Roman pre-Christian times, spiritual seekers would travel to this area, to a peninsula called Finisterre, that they believed was the end of the earth. And so they would go there to see the beauty and really looking for God, to encounter God. And then in 800 AD, so 1,200 years ago, a group of Christians talked to the bishop in northwest Spain, a Celtic area called Galicia, that they had discovered the remains of James the Elder, the brother of John, who was the first among the 12 to be martyred. It was believed that James had preached the gospel there before his death in Jerusalem in this area. And so they had discovered his remains. That's a whole story that we don't have time for about that. But they built a cathedral in the city of Santiago named after the apostle. And his remains are reputed to be there today. So there's a picture here. Along the way, I had no intent of going to see this. But once I got to the church, I was like, I might as well go down into the crypt and see. This is in that box, is reputed to be the remains of the apostle. And people have been traveling there ever since, with up to 2,000 people arriving every day. And so it might seem strange to sort of like walk across the country to see a silver box. I don't know if that's weird to you or not. But it's, I think, a deeply embedded human quality to want to be near someone or something that has also been near to someone or something that we admire, right? So we buy Red Wings jerseys signed by our favorite Red Wing because we want that they've worn. It's this, we want that thing that's been close to something that we love. And so we didn't walk to go to this place. We walked because, not for the destination, but for the journey. For Megan and I, it was a spiritual exercise of taking time every day to be with God. The destination was like gravy. But we were there walking on this journey to encounter God. And though I never intended on going to see this crypt, as I stood there for a few moments, I did feel God stirring my spirit, confirming the call that Megan and I have to doing ministry in the manner of the apostles, in the way of the apostles. So, James was one of the 12, and we wanted to lean in. I felt confirmed and convicted to continue to lean into the ministry that Jesus gave the 12, that's come all the way through history to us. And especially for us, our new vocational work that we're engaging in. We've stepped down from pastoring a local church, and now we're giving ourselves full time to catalyzing a decentralized network of replicating, disciple-making, simple churches for every neighborhood of Metro Detroit and beyond. And so as we stood there, just in the presence, just there, I felt that conviction rise. And so it was good. Now, I came to the Camino, again, with 3 questions for God that I had sort of thoughtfully prepared and prayerfully prepared. And it turns out, I don't know if you've had this experience, but it turns out that God also had some conversation topics that he wanted to bring with me. Have you ever had that happen? You might have some questions for God. Turns out God has some topics that he'd like to talk to you as well. And I had tried to not burden my journey with expectations about how awesome it would be, or expectations that it would be transformational or life-changing. One of the best ways to make an experience not life-changing is to expect it to be life-changing. Does that make sense? Once you demand that or expect it, you're pretty sure to kill it. So instead, I just tried to allow the Camino to be whatever God would have for me. So along the way, I had two primary insights. The first of which I'll share today, and the second of which I'll be sharing sometime later this summer. Dan's asked me to come back again, so I'll be sharing that later. We're working out the date with his schedule. But it didn't take long. I don't know if this has happened for you. It didn't take long for God to start working in me. He literally started on day one. So a week ago, it's 40 days. You sort of think we'll work our way into it a little bit, but God was like, let's just get started on day one. And I don't know, you would know this, is the smart-looking crowd here. Turns out Europe doesn't use dollars. Did you know that? So they use this thing called euros, which is not euros. Sounds very similar, but you can't pay in sandwiches. But they use euros, which we knew. We're a little well-traveled than that. But we knew this, but we had brought dollars knowing we could use credit, but we sort of thought, hey, we'll get there. Literally people from 100 nations of the world do this walk every year. So we figured the starting place, the starting city, Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, it's a tourist town. Surely the banks will easily, of course, trade our world-famous U.S. dollars into euros, equally famous. So we get there. We don't exchange in Detroit because various reasons. We don't exchange in Paris because the Paris airport was short-staffed because of COVID. It was a mess. So we arrive at our start. We're like, oh, that's right. We need to change our dollars that we brought into euros. So we go to the bank, and it's France. And so they're like, dollars, no. We have no use for dollars. We don't touch them. Why did you even bring them here? Why didn't you trade them back in your bank in the U.S.? I was like, my bank here, my town is smaller than this bank here. But she didn't want to hear that. So we had no euros. And we're thinking, okay, well, the big Spanish town, Pamplona, is 3 days away. When we get there, we'll go to the bank there and exchange our dollars there. Well, what day do we get to Pamplona on? Sunday. Banks open on Sunday, banks close on Sunday. Pamplona is, as Megan and I heard, a very religious city. No banks open, it's all closed. And that was actually true the whole time. So we are walking. We had 5 euros, which I gave to the cab driver as a tip, which meant we now had 0 euros to walk 40 days through Europe, which, let me tell you, is an adventure. So we go, and the first day is one of the 2 hardest days. We're going to get you right out of the gate, and then again right at the end, are the 2 hardest days. So you go 13 and a half miles up the mountain, and then a mile and a half steeply down the mountain. And it's pretty physically demanding. And the town that you're going to, your first stop on the Camino, is a town called Roncesvalles, Spain. You've never heard of it because the population of Roncesvalles is 30 people. So look around the room. This is twice as large, or online, 10 times as large. So joking. It's much larger than the population of Roncesvalles, Spain. So I'm walking down the mountain, and you're sort of navigating, not turning your feet or breaking your knees or anything like that. And I'm looking at this town, and there are 4 buildings: the hotel, the hostel, the church, and town hall or whatever, right? There's nobody. It's small. And I'm looking at this, and I knew that they would take Visa on the trip. But I look at that town, and I start irrationally being anxious. And I look and I say, there's no way that town is going to take my Apple Pay Visa. It's just not going to happen. We're used to traveling in Africa where credit cards are an anomaly. So I've not rewound the fact that Europe is in the 21st century. And so I'm looking at this town, I'm like, there's no way this is going to work. And we stop half mile before the town. Megan's resting. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I just started crying. Have you ever been there? you're just sort of get anxious. You start freaking out because we have 40 days. There's 40 more days of this. And I thought, if this is the beginning, what's going to come? And I start thinking, man, I've got a lot of burrito weight in the middle. I'm sure I can sort of just like cinch down my belts. I'll lose some weight. It'll be really good for me health-wise. My nurse, our doctor will be excited. The Mediterranean diet worked. And so, thank you for laughing. Anyway, so just, I want to go off notes, but I'm not. So I'm thinking like, I'm literally wargaming. I'm sitting there. Who's been here, right? Is anyone willing to raise their hand and say they've been there, and you're thinking in your head, you're strategizing, like how it's going to be okay that whatever you're anxious about is not working out like you'd hope. So I'm thinking through all these things, and then right into that moment, I'm talking to Meg a little bit. She's like, Jim, come on, it's going to be fine. But I'm irrationally anxious. I'm worst case scenario planning. And into that moment, into my anxious thoughts, I hear God speak, hey, can I talk? I got something to say. So I'm like, yeah, God, if you want to add anything to the mix, And so God says, didn't I send you here in my name? And I said, fine, maybe. And then he said, didn't I send the 12 out in my name? More confidently, yeah, of course you did. Didn't I provide for the 12 every single day of their lives? Didn't I tell them not to worry? Didn't I teach them that they didn't need to take a money belt or all those things because I would provide for them every day? Do you think I'm capable, Jim, of doing the same thing for you? Maybe. Maybe. I'm just being honest. And so I don't know if you've ever been there. I was there. I had to really choose. I had to make a choice. Am I going to trust or not trust? You know that trust fall? Right? You have to choose to trust that someone's going to catch you. You know what I'm talking about? I had to choose to trust that God was going to catch us if we kept doing this walk. That we would be able to go 40 days across the country with no local currency. Which meant, our hotels and our breakfasts were provided for. So I'm thinking, okay, every breakfast was steal extra croissants and stuff them in our backpack. That's literally where my head was at. I'm thinking, how much cheese can we put in? That's literally, I'm not exaggerating. That's where my head was at. But God was like, don't you think I can trust? Don't you think I can provide? So it goes on. We go, wouldn't you know it? They take they even took American Express. God was like, I'm just going to over-provide for you. So it worked out. The next day, I still was anxious. It worked out. And then we go forward a couple weeks. We meet this Canadian couple. We became friends with them. And the wife, we told her our story. She was like, you mean this has confirmed everything for me. She's like, you're traveling across Spain with no euros? That must be a fun game. And I'm like, it ain't a game. It's our actual life. This is our life. Am I eating dinner? Because we would come to a town. Those cafes were we're looking to see the little Visa sign, or is there a sign that says, do you take credit? We don't take, that was our experience. Every place we stopped, we'd always be looking. We had one time where we thought it was a very bougie cafe. We assumed for sure they're going to take credit. We ordered our coffee. They didn't, and they insisted that we drink it. It was a drink of shame. We were just drinking it. It was awkward. And so we buy 50 euros from this Canadian couple eventually. We're we humble ourselves to buy the euros from them. The next day, we spent, how much of those euros the next day do you think we spent? 50 and 20 cents. We actually went over, but she gave us a discount. And so we spent all 50 the next day. And I was thinking to myself, I was with God. I was like, God, I'm really mad right now. That was supposed to be our reserve for the whole rest of our time. How could we have possibly spent it? Blah, 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 blah. I was mad at God, and God was like, Jim, can I get a word in edgewise? Stop talking. Don't you think I gave you those 50 euros because I knew that you would need them today? Don't you think, Jim, that I could give you? And I was like, this is really my actual response was, It was my actual response. Fine. Then he says, don't you think I can just give you more tomorrow if you need them? Maybe. Yes, fine. And then, it was a recurring theme. So it worked out. There's more to the story, but it worked out. We were provided every day that we needed. It was a real life lesson. In Matthew 6, 33 and 34, Jesus teaches us that we're not to worry about tomorrow, but instead seek first God's rule and reign in every situation of today. Seek first his kingdom, Jesus says, and his righteousness, meaning God's, and all of these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Can I get a witness? Jesus reminds us about the birds of the air and the flowers of the field, both of which we saw in abundance along the Camino, and how they do not toil, and yet God provides for them exactly what they need. As I reflected on what Jesus was speaking to me in the moment and from Scripture, I came to see how often maybe I should just say I don't want to put anything on you. You can decide if this is you or not. I came to see how often I use plans for the future as a way to control outcomes or secure what I think is best. As a way to rely on my plan instead of relying on God. Now, it's fine to plan. I'm glad I planned to get here on time today, but not as a way to eliminate God, nor cease to rely on him. I began to see how often we plan to eliminate having to rely on God. Instead, we can hold all of our plans loosely before God, not using those plans to seek our own kingdom or our own provision, but trusting God. God has been speaking to me this almost daily, both then and still today after the Camino. Our challenge in depending on God is that we have to surrender control. Our society and our culture in America in particular, we crave control. We are used to controlling our environments. Yet to rely on God, we have to release control to God. We have to release that control. I one time, years ago, was praying, and it was my day off, and I was worried about something, and God said, don't you think I can take care of that? And I'm just being honest, I literally said, no, I can do it. I'm like, as if I'm a better pastor than God. Think about that. That's me being honest, but what other areas of our lives do we do that in? Another challenge to relying on God is that we must trust in God's love. It can be especially difficult if most of our spirituality is simply information and not relationship, and for those of us who are task-oriented. If we have inadequate space in our lives for simply sitting in the loving gaze of Jesus, of fostering loving, joyful attachment with Jesus, we will underdevelop our reliance in the loving goodness of God. And a third challenge, if we're honest, is the humility of dependence and asking for help. Do you know this? When you have to ask for help, it's a humbling thing sometimes. Especially for those of us, I count myself included, who feel competent or like to feel competent. I'm not very competent at anything, but I pretend I'm competent. It can be particularly chafing to have to ask for help. So later, after that 50 euros, it was very hard to go to the Canadians who could easily exchange US dollars. They had extra euros. It was humbling and difficult to say, Even though I paid for it, it was still humbling. I tried to give him more money. He's like, why are you giving me more money? Stop it. Later, we bought 100 more euros. Megan did that part. She was like, I'm still trying to figure out what's going on. Megan has no problem doing that. She's already making the transaction. She's way ahead of me. It's humbling to ask for help. It's humbling to rely on God. And yet, many of the great heroes and heroines of Scripture regularly asked for help in this way. They were humble. I think about Elijah the prophet. I spent a lot of time thinking about Elijah the prophet and his story while I was walking. James 5:17 tells us that Elijah was a human just like us. And yet he was considered one of the greatest of the prophets. You know, when Jesus appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration, it was Moses, the giver of the law, and Elijah, the prophet. The lawgiver and the greatest of the prophets. What made Elijah the greatest? What made him so great? I don't think it was his prophetic record or his miraculous wonders. He did many of those things. But if we look at Elijah's life, for the 4 years or so that he was doing ministry, literally only 4 of those days was he doing in public. The other 1,200 days, he was hiding. Literally, no one knew where he was. They were trying to find him, and they couldn't. How amazing can you be in hiding? He was doing nothing except eating what the crows brought. That made him great. Think about that. What is great about that? He was in hiding with the widow of Zarephath, spending time for a year with her and her son. The more I reflected on the story, the more that I discerned that his greatness was his reliance on God. A powerful mixture of faith and hope that provided joyful, trusting, intimate connection. This tells me that greatness is not only revealed in God's power, but it's also revealed in our vulnerability, in our weakness. It's not our plans, it's not the public things, it's in the hidden space of our reliance that God reveals himself to us. You know, the Camino is filled with lots of stories of the pilgrims that have walked it. Like I mentioned, 1,200 years now, people have been walking the Camino. And there are stories, you know, we saw stories and read stories along the way of pilgrims that had miracles happen, and we are aware of the stories. You know, we were like posh pilgrims. Sure, we carried our stuff on our back, but we stayed in hotels. We had our breakfast provided. It was all planned, and we only went one way. Pilgrims, old pilgrims, would walk like the song, I would walk 500 miles, and I would walk 500 more, because they had to go home. They had to walk there and back. We just went one way. So people are drawn to their experience of the drama and the miraculous and the sense of adventure of their hardships and struggles, and they're overcoming, walking bare feet in poverty, all these things, the experiences they had with God through their pilgrimages. And I think many contemporary pilgrims on the Camino and in life hope for something similar. And yet, it's fascinating to see how many modern pilgrims, ourselves included, use technology and equipment and planning in an effort to mitigate the suffering. So instead of having to figure out where you're going to stay each day, CaminoWays.com will do all that work for you. Without realizing that as we do that, we're simultaneously, unintentionally mitigating the depth of the experience as well. as we use convenience and eliminate the hardship, we're also reducing the effect of the experience and encounter with God. Because the hardship is part of the thing. There is no multiplication without death. Jesus said so. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground, it dies. It remains by itself alone. But if it dies, there's fruitfulness. That hardship and sacrifice is part of the growth. And so if we're too busy using technology, we mitigate this, we eliminate the suffering, we're also reducing the encounter. And I wonder how often this happens in other significant endeavors that we engage in. Parenting, disciple making in church, education maybe, all sorts of other areas. We're mitigating the suffering and thereby mitigating the growth. In a similar way, we passed a map of the Camino along the path that had villages named. I think there's a picture of this here. These were often found along the trail, especially when you would enter like a new province. We passed through four regions and 7 or 8 provinces. And when that happened, they'd have a map, and that would list all the spots. 400 years ago, that map would have been a huge godsend because they had nothing. They're like, oh, the next town is this. I have a cousin that lives there. I know where it is. That would be a huge godsend. Most of the time, the only use of that map was for graffiti. We would just blow by. Because why? We had a guidebook that had a map and details. We had our phones with the map right on it. We didn't need that. We already knew what was coming. It occurred to me, we had money to buy things that eliminated the need for that. It occurred to me how often and easy it is to use even our resources, like wealth, to take the place of relying on God. And we're able to use our resources to make plans and minimize our need for daily, intimate reliance, like Jesus taught and Elijah practiced. Let me make one more point about this. On our 3rd day in, so very early in the trip, Megan and I stopped by a cafe to rest. There's a picture of it here. There's all the flags of all the countries that have been there. There's a German guy there seated, and the man standing is the proprietor of the cafe, a guy from Belgium. Now, this particular cafe was like a half mile off the trail, which doesn't seem like much because we think of that as, that's like a 30-second drive. But if you're walking, and it's a 14-mile hike already, walking an extra half mile suddenly becomes more of a thing. It was the only one that was open. It was advertised. They had a little sign in the trees advertising it. And this guy was wonderful. As you can see, they had Coca-Cola Zero. The Spaniards love Coke Zero even more than America. Coca-Cola Sin Azúcar was everywhere. It was amazing. My wife was in love. She wants to go to Spain only for that purpose alone. This guy had walked 5 Caminos about, the Belgian proprietor. He was wonderful. And we were already beginning to feel the weight of our packs 3 days in. And this gentleman, born with the wisdom born of experience, talked to us about how every pilgrim brings more than they need on the Camino. Every single one brings stuff that they don't need. You think you're going to need this, you think you're going to need that. Everyone does it. And he said how almost every pilgrim ends up getting rid of stuff that they bring on the walk. You could see in some places like spare shoes, like on rocks. We left bags of things in hotel rooms along the way. There's people wearing my shoes in Burgos right now or whatever. And so people bring more than they need. He encouraged us. He says, look, by the 3rd week, your shape will change, you'll lose weight, you'll be strong. But he encouraged us to get rid of whatever it was that we didn't need. To dump that anything and everything that unnecessarily weighed us down. Who does that sound like, right? It sounds like Jesus to me. It's what the author of Hebrews talked about in Hebrews 12, about getting rid of everything that encumbers us and ties us down. And a lesson for the journey is we often carry things, even things that might be good, that we don't need. We're relying on them instead of the simplicity of depending on God. So what things are encumbering you? There's the sin that easily entangles, but then there's the things that weigh us down. What's weighing you down? On the trip, I would often worship God in song with my phone, my playlist on Apple Music, with the song Jireh. Does anyone know Jireh by Maverick City Music and Elevation? I love that song. It was often on my morning playlist before I would go down for croissants and cured ham and local cheese at breakfast. And as I would worship and as I would walk, we had hours of walking and thinking and praying, I got to thinking of the story behind that song. And it connected for me with what God was already saying to me through these other things I've been talking about. In the interest of time, I won't read all of Genesis 22, which is the background. But we can think of Abraham on the mountain. I have a few pictures of mountains here. The question is, so here's the story. Abraham was in the land, and he's called by God. God says, I'm going to bless you so that through you and Sarah, all of the nations of the earth will be blessed. And I'm calling you to leave your father's house, your father's people, and your father's land, and to go to a place that I will show you. No guidebook, no map on the side of the road. I'm just telling you to go and to follow my spirit. And when you get there, which Abram finally and eventually did, and when he got there, God promised him, because he had no children, God promised he and Sarah a son. They had a son. It was the son in their old age. It was a huge blessing to them. And then that very son that was the good gift of God, God asked them to sacrifice. So Abram goes up to the mountain to make the sacrifice. His son's like, where's the ram for the sacrifice? Abram says to his son Isaac, God will provide the ram. And so they get there, and Abram is right ready. There's a great painting by Rembrandt of this scene where Abram's following through on what the difficult thing that God had asked him to do. And right in that moment, God intervenes and says, Abram, stop. Here's the ram for the sacrifice. I see now that you will not withhold anything from me. And he provides the ram. In that moment, that song comes from there, because it says in Hebrew that the mountain was called, or God was called Jehovah Jireh. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Here's what the Lord spoke to me from that story. How many of us want that kind of Jehovah Jireh provision? How many of us are thinking, man, I want God to come and provide for me miraculously now? How many, right? I see a few hands. I am raising my hand. We want that, and yet how many of us are willing to live sacrificially in such a way that we're so reliant on God that only God's provision will make a way? Abram had left everything, even the very good gift of God, he was sacrificing. We often want God's provision in that way, but yet we're unwilling to live sacrificially in so that our hands are open to receive what only God can give. Our hands are still holding everything so that there's nowhere for God's provision to go. When God asked Abram to sacrifice the very gift that God had given then, and Abram let that go, that is the context for the moment of Jireh provision. And what would that look like for us? How can we depend on God so radically that we're able to receive that provision because our hearts and hands are prepared for it? Let me close with this sort of thought that comes, that sort of undergirds everything I've said so far. In Luke 6:43-45, Jesus teaches us that it's what comes out of the heart that defiles us, and that it's what comes out of the heart that makes us clean. Meaning that God's more concerned with our hearts than our outer appearance. A number of years ago, Jesus highlighted for me how when it comes to busyness, who here struggles with busyness in their lives? My hand is raised, a few bold hands. The rest of us are too busy multitasking to raise our hands. That was a joke, maybe. We have to attend, when it comes to business, we have to pay attention to our bodies and our hearts. We can have busy bodies, busy hearts. Most people live there. Our calendars are full and our hearts are full of worry. But we also know that you can be not doing much but still have a very worried heart. And it's not that God wants us to do nothing. Instead, Jesus was very active in his life, plenty to do. And yet we know that Jesus, though active in his life, regularly, his heart was at peace always. And so it's tempting to focus only on our bodies and our calendars when slowing down. But the deeper work is inside our hearts. And that takes longer to unwind the busy and hurry and worry. There's a picture here of the road, I think maybe a couple, right? We walked 500 miles of that, right? This long road that keeps stretching out to the horizon. It just keeps going. And what I've learned is we don't slow down long enough or intentionally enough to get at what's inside. We might be thinking, man, I'm so busy at work right now. I'm going to pop up to the cabin up north for the weekend. And what happens when you get to the cabin up north for the weekend? You're busy mowing the grass and fixing the screens and doing got to put the dock in, all that stuff. And then what happens? It's like 3 days later, I got to get back to the grind. I know I'm not even going to ask for a show of hands because I know there's yeses in that here. Or we won't have that happen, but just maybe in our everyday life, we're trying to sit in silence, and just as it's there, and we realize there's some, in the quiet of my heart is some pain. Man, I wonder what's going on Facebook, right? We allow distractions to get in the way of the deeper work. Just as we're getting to the real stuff, it's painful or hard or time-consuming, and so we stop. Or we settle for something less. You've got to walk that road. The work happens in the long obedience in the same direction. It's this long obedience. There were multiple times where I was like, 1 week from the end, I felt like I'm ready to go home. And God said to me, Jim, I still have things for you. I want you to pay attention. We have to keep sticking to it over time, long enough, and keep doing so to get to the roots. It doesn't have to be a 40-day walk across Spain. Really, this is a capstone. This is a daily thing that happens every day where we make space in our lives, even if it's just the 7 minutes while the coffee is brewing. That's the place to start. Hopefully it turns into more, but it can start there, where we're letting God get down to the roots, where we go for a walk. Hey, instead of eating another Big Mac at McDonald's or Chipotle bowl, why don't I just take a walk and be in quiet with God this Wednesday? It could be Wednesday walking with God at lunch. We have to just do that work over time. 2 closing thoughts with that build on that. We have to live with intention. Too often we act like passengers in our own lives, waiting for life to happen to us and reacting. Instead, we must be active participants. I see so many people, they're living right in front of a speed bump. And they're like, man, this speed bump's so hard to get over. But if only they could just overcome that first little speed bump, they'd get going. But they're paralyzed in front of that speed bump. Just the intention of getting over to the other side. And then, really, like I've already said, this work is long, hard, patient work, often involving suffering and hardship in order to bear fruit. Laboring faithfully at what God has given us to do. Just like the pilgrimage, our discipleship to Jesus and living out our vocation is a long obedience in the same direction. Amen? And I pray that you begin to walk your 500 miles today or tomorrow. with Jesus. Well, let's